Now, it is my pleasure, and I say this from the bottom of my heart, to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening. For most of you, he is not going to be a stranger. The works of Shaykh Hasan Eaton have been described as sublime, poetic, and masterful. Charles Eaton was born in Switzerland and educated at Charterhouse at King's College, Cambridge. He worked for many years as a teacher and journalist in Jamaica and Egypt, where he embraced Islam in 1951 before joining the British diplomatic service. Having embraced Islam, Shaykh Hasan has been wise counselor to Britain's Muslim community, whose vision has always been based on the love of the Messenger. He has served as a consultant at the Islamic Cultural Center. His books have transformed lives and are today a towering record of scholarship and literary excellence. He is author of King of the Castle, Islam and the Destiny of Man, and the must-read Remembering God. A frequent writer, commentator on Islamic theology, spirituality, and current affairs, his recent work has been featured in Q News, including a seminal essay on the topic of justice in the week after the 7/7 bombing. Shaykh Hasan Eaton.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Brothers and sisters in Islam, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to see you all here. Now, the subject this evening is the middle way. And that, in fact, might be called one of the definitions of Islam, which has been always the religion of the middle way, because it is the religion of peace. And peace is only at the center, and peace is never at the extremes. Now, there are many different ways in which we can understand this concept of the middle way. And the first one that I want to deal with relates to excess, or rather to two different forms of excess. One, of course, is fanaticism, violence, quote, terrorism, unquote. The other is consumerism. And both are forms of self-indulgence. Now, that may seem an odd suggestion to make, to say that the path of violence is a form of self-indulgence. But what we have to remember is that anger, just like lust and like other very strong emotions, begs to be released, begs to find expression. And those who are consumed with anger must hit out in some way or another. And I believe, although it may shock some of you, that this may even apply to suicide bombers who are so possessed with fury and with dismay that they must find a way of expressing it, and in the end, the only way they can find is through self-destruction. Now, I'll give a very minor example of that. The older ones among you will remember the events in the Lebanon when Palestinian refugees in Shatila and another camp were massacred. Now, it happens that I was working at that time at the Islamic Cultural Center, and I had a colleague there who was the mildest of men, moderate, gentle, certainly unaggressive. But that morning, the morning that the news burst in the papers, he said to me, "I dare not go out I dare not go out into the street because I know I'm going to hit the first person I pass. Now that was very interesting because it was a clear demonstration that anger, unless it is thoroughly controlled, must find an outlet, and that outlet may well be to strike at someone or people who have nothing to do with the case at all and no guilt. Hence the very ready and all too frequent killing of the innocent as a way of expressing the anger that many of our brothers feel. Now again, anger is a form of drunkenness. We all know that alcohol is prohibited in Islam for the obvious reason that alcohol makes us drunk. But we may forget sometimes that there are many different forms of drunkenness, and they all have something in common. And the drunkenness of anger is just as misleading as the drunkenness of alcohol. It is just as liable to upset judgment, to make us incapable of effective action, because effective action depends entirely upon sober judgment. Now, this means that in practice, those who are seized by such anger lose all logic, lose all rationality, and by that very fact, they become ineffectual. In other words, they are less capable than they would be when sober of achieving the ends which they seek and which they most value. Now, that leads me to perhaps a digression. But I must mention a point which I think is too much forgotten when people talk of 9/11 and the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York. And I've sometimes shocked people by suggesting to them that this was a pinprick, no more than a pinprick. Now, it is extraordinary that people have forgotten that only a very few years ago, we all of us lived under the greatest threat that human beings have ever faced, the very real, the very actual threat of nuclear war. And this is why I tend to dislike the term terrorism and references to terror, because I think it is extremely important to use words with their correct meaning. And terror is a big word. If somebody is terrified, they're trembling, they're sick in the stomach, they turn white, they cannot sleep, they cannot eat. Now, do we know anybody who is so terrified by the prospect of a possible bomb in a bus or a tube? I don't think we do. There may be people who are worried. But terror is too strong a word for this. And again, the comparison is obvious. During the time when we lived under that threat of nuclear war, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we came, as is now recognized, within a whisper of facing total destruction. Were people terrified then? Were we terrified? We had good reason to be, but we were not. People went on with their lives quite normally. Now, the misuse of words, such as the misuse of the term terror, which I've suggested to you, is dangerous. Just because it's a big word, it can justify a big reaction. And an event which I've suggested to you was no more than a pinprick has been used as an excuse for the invasion of Iraq, and above all for the curtailment of the liberties dear to the British people and dear to the American people. For if you can persuade people that something absolutely dreadful is threatened, then you can make them complacent when you deprive them of their liberties. So on the one hand, we have that extreme, the extreme of violence. On the other, we have consumerism. And as I think everybody recognizes, the world today is, or at least the Western world, the rich world, is, you might say, consumed by consumerism. The Quran refers to greed for more and more and condemns that absolutely. We today are constantly greedy, and we are encouraged to be greedy, particularly by advertising, which tries to persuade us to buy many things that we don't need. We are even encouraged to be greedy by government authorities who want us to spend, because that is good for the economy, or so it is supposed. But the world is flooded today in the West with all sorts of unnecessary goods which we are encouraged to buy. In fact, one reason that we have people, particularly in England, working appalling long hours with little chance to be with their family, little energy to be with their children, working, as they say, to make ends meet, but working also because they need the money to buy a better television, a better this, a better that, to buy things that are not essential and are not really necessary. Now, Islam is very clear upon this point. Excess is condemned, and excessive greed is certainly and very powerfully condemned. But very often we don't even recognize that we have become greedy people. It's the way of things. It's the normal way of life to want better and better television, better and better, more powerful cars, and all the rest of it. We don't need these things. But in demanding them, in wanting them, in buying them, we are in fact contributing, albeit in a small way individually, to the depletion of the resources of this planet. And this is something that is easy to forget because we shall not see immediate disaster as the result. It is our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren who are likely to suffer. But the fact remains that we have used up the resources of the earth in the past 100, 150 years in a way that never happened in the past. And we continue to do so, and we continue in doing so to pollute the earth. One example, perhaps, may be the question of traveling, dashing to and fro across the world in aircraft. During the war, which of course my time, but not yours, most of you, during the war there were notices posted all over the place saying, "Is your journey really necessary?" I sometimes wish that such notices were still to be seen, because most journeys are probably not necessary, And yet, every aircraft that takes off anywhere in the world is adding a small little bit to the pollution that is so dangerous for this world. Now, this means for us that we have to try to limit our needs. And that is particularly difficult because temptation lies on every side and encouragement to excess is on every side. It is a matter for the individual sometimes to sit back, particularly when they see a very tempting advertisement in the paper at morning, something reduced price, something they don't need, but all the same, buying a bargain is saving money, or so we often feel. And it is a matter of thinking twice, of thinking 3 times before rushing out to add to our possessions, which we cannot take with us when we die, and which, for the most part, are not really necessary to our well-being in this life. So that moderation is one of the principal features of the middle way. Moderation in all things, not least in our desires for the goods of this world. Now, there is another characteristic of the middle way which you may point out and which I'm going to challenge, and that is tolerance. Now, it only struck me the other day because we're always telling people that Islam is a tolerant religion. It suddenly struck me I must really look up in the dictionary and see exactly what it means. And it comes, in fact, from a Latin word meaning to endure evil. And in English usage, classical usage, it does mean, in fact, to endure, to put up with things that we don't like, but also to put up with things that we should not put up with. And that is not what most people understand by tolerance. Because as Muslims, we are commanded to be compassionate, to be understanding, to use our intelligence in understanding other people. But we are not, most certainly not commanded to take an entirely helpless attitude in the face of evil. The Quran, among the many terms used to describe the Quran, one of them is the criterion of good and evil. And we are, in fact, as Muslims, required to make judgments. Now, that is a delicate task, for we are only human, and our judgment is fallible and often unreliable. But we must nonetheless have some opinion when we face what is evil, what is obviously, palpably evil, because we are commanded, if we can change it by our hands, to change it. If we can change it by speech only, to change it by speech. If we are so powerless that we can only change it in our hearts, nonetheless, to change it in our hearts by condemning it. Now, this is a responsibility, a huge responsibility. In the early days of Islam, it is said that those who were called upon to act as judges of the community, often trembled when required to give a judgment, fearing that it might be a wrong judgment, and because of their responsibility, the responsibility of their position, they might therefore be condemned by Allah Ta'ala for this wrong judgment. We must always acknowledge an element of doubt, but in seeing a scale between yes and no, if you like, we must dwell in the center and in all humility make our judgment. Now finally, an essential feature of the Muslim soul, the Muslim mentality, is, I believe, a sense of proportion. And we are helped to have a sense of proportion by the example of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. For this was one of his great characteristics, a perfect sense of proportion which put things where they belong, in the right order. And that is extremely difficult, and to do that we need his example, just as we need the counsel and guidance of the Quran. Much then is required of us as Muslims. But that is the price we pay for the privilege of being Muslims. We cannot shrug our shoulders. We are required to make judgments, to hold firmly to the middle way, which is Islam. And in doing so, to hope that we will please our Creator. Alhamdulillah wahdahu bihi nasta'in. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.